What if the Roman Empire never collapsed? The screen is black. Then, faintly, the sound of marching feet. Thousands of sandals striking stone in perfect rhythm. A standard of the Roman eagle bursts into view, shimmering in the sunlight. Behind it, legions stretch to the horizon, their shields glinting like a river of bronze. Narrator's voice cuts in, deep and commanding. For centuries, the Roman Empire ruled with an iron hand, shaping laws, languages, and legacies that still echo today. But history tells us that Rome fell, swallowed by corruption, division, and the tides of barbarian conquest. Yet what if Rome never collapsed? What if the eagle had never lowered its wings? The march grows louder, the question lingers, and the story begins. The 3rd century after Christ was no age of peace, but of shadows. The Roman Empire stretched like a colossus across the known world, from the wind-swept cliffs of Britannia to the deserts of Arabia, from the green forests of Gaul to the sun-burned plains of Egypt. For centuries, it had seemed eternal, the single most powerful political entity mankind had ever created. Yet behind the facade of marble temples and triumphal arches, cracks had begun to spread across its foundations. The empire was enormous, but also fragile, as though the weight of its own glory threatened to crush it. The crisis began at the top. The imperial purple, once the symbol of divine order, became little more than a death sentence. Emperors were raised by armies, murdered by rivals, betrayed by their own guards. In a span of 50 years, more than 24 emperors would rise and fall, some reigning for mere months before being cut down by sword or poison. The throne of Augustus, which had once seemed the pinnacle of human achievement, became a throne of daggers. Meanwhile, the frontiers trembled. To the north, across the Danube and the Rhine, restless tribes gathered. Goths, Alemanni, Franks. They were no longer scattered bands of raiders, but entire peoples on the move, pressed forward by hunger and by new enemies further east. Each season, new incursions struck Roman lands. Cities that had never known fear saw their walls shaken by barbarian rams. Villages that had once prospered under the shadow of Rome now burned in sudden, terrifying raids. To the east, an older foe sharpened its blade. The Sassanid Persians, heirs to centuries of rivalry with Rome, saw opportunity in her weakness. Their armies clashed with the legions on the plains of Mesopotamia, pushing deep into Syria and Armenia. Captured Roman emperors were paraded through Persian streets in chains, a humiliation unthinkable in earlier ages. For the first time, the empire was not merely threatened, it was humiliated, its aura of invincibility shattered. And as if war and rebellion were not enough, nature itself conspired against Rome. Waves of plague swept across the provinces, carried by trade routes that once bound the empire together. Crops failed, populations thinned, armies found themselves unable to replenish their ranks. Where once there had been abundance, now there was scarcity, and scarcity bred discontent. Farmers abandoned their fields, cities shrank, and the hum of Roman life grew quieter with each passing decade. The crisis of the 3rd century was not one single event, but a gathering storm, a tempest with many winds. Political chaos, foreign invasion, economic collapse, and pestilence all combined to batter the empire at once. For the first time in centuries, ordinary Romans began to wonder if the empire was truly eternal, or if the gods had turned their faces away. Senators in marble halls debated desperately, generals gambled for power, and peasants clung to survival as the world they knew seemed to tilt toward the abyss. Imagine being a citizen in this time. You walk through streets where statues of emperors are erected and torn down in the same decade. You hear rumors of entire legions wiped out in distant provinces, of barbarian kings demanding tribute from governors who no longer trust Rome to protect them. You see temples to forgotten gods crumble, while new religions whisper of salvation beyond the empire's grasp. You feel, in your bones, that something vast is ending. And yet, even as the storm raged, the empire endured. Legionaries still marched, governors still issued decrees, And Rome, battered but unbroken, clung to life. It was no longer the unchallenged master of the world, but a wounded giant, bleeding yet unbowed, staring down the horizon where new threats gathered like thunderclouds. This was the world on the edge of change. The air was thick with tension, as though history itself held its breath. And somewhere, beyond the walls of the eternal city, the first rumblings of catastrophe could already be heard. The 4th century dawned with both hope and dread. After decades of chaos, a soldier emperor named Diocletian rose from obscurity to grasp the purple. Unlike many before him, he did not chase glory through battle alone. He pursued order through reform. He saw that no single man could govern a world stretching from the misty highlands of Britannia to the scorching frontiers of Egypt. His answer was radical. The empire would no longer be ruled by one Augustus, but by two, each with a Caesar to assist. It was a tetrarchy, a system meant to share power, to bring stability where civil war had reigned. At first it seemed to work. Armies were reorganized, taxes restructured, the borders strengthened. Diocletian was ruthless, crushing rebellions with an iron hand. Yet even his reforms could not halt the deeper currents pulling Rome apart. The people groaned under heavy taxation, and the loyalties of soldiers remained ever fickle. When Diocletian retired, the only emperor to do so voluntarily, the empire soon slid back toward division. Then came Constantine, a man whose ambition rivaled Caesar's, and whose vision would forever change the empire. He fought his way to sole rule, his legions clashing in titanic battles that decided the fate of the world. At the Milvian Bridge in 312, he claimed victory under the sign of a new god, Christianity. The empire that had once sacrificed to Jupiter and Mars now bent its knee to the cross. Temples of old gods began to fade, while basilicas rose across the provinces. But Constantine's most enduring act was not in religion, but geography. On the shores of the Bosporus, he founded a new capital, Constantinople. A city of gleaming walls and golden domes, it stood astride Europe and Asia, a fortress of commerce and power. The old city of Rome still lived, but the heart of the empire had shifted eastward. In this moment, the seeds of division were planted, for the east was rich, vibrant, and defensible. Grain from Egypt, trade from Persia, silk from China, all flowed into Constantinople's markets. Its walls, triple-layered and impregnable, made it nearly unassailable. In contrast, the west grew thin and weary. Gaul and Spain bled from constant invasions. Italy struggled with poverty, and the once proud city of Rome itself fell into decline. By the late 4th century, the empire had become two worlds tethered uneasily together. The East thrived, a Greek-speaking powerhouse wrapped in Christian faith. The West limped, Latin-speaking but fractured, its armies filled with mercenaries whose loyalty was for sale. And across the horizon, storm clouds gathered. Entire nations of Goths, Vandals, and Franks pressed against the Rhine and the Danube, driven forward by a new terror, steppe horsemen from the east, the Huns. In 376, disaster struck. Tens of thousands of Goths begged to cross the Danube, fleeing the Huns' onslaught. The Romans allowed them in, but corruption and cruelty turned potential allies into enemies. Within 2 years, the Goths revolted, and at the Battle of Adrianople in 378, the empire suffered one of its greatest defeats. An emperor, Valens, lay dead on the field, his legions broken, their armor strewn across the ground. For the first time since Cannae, Rome had been annihilated in open battle. The myth of Roman invincibility was gone. Though the East recovered, the West did not. It staggered under the weight of war, famine, and betrayal. In 410, the unthinkable occurred. Alaric and his Visigoths marched into Rome and sacked the Eternal City. 8 centuries had passed since foreign enemies last breached its walls. The shock reverberated across the world. Saint Jerome, writing in distant Bethlehem, confessed he could scarcely believe it. Pagans said the gods had abandoned the empire. Christians claimed it was punishment for sin, but all agreed on one thing: the empire was mortal. Rome endured, but it was now a ghost of its former self. In the West, emperors were puppets of generals, and generals were puppets of ambition. The East watched warily, thriving behind Constantinople's walls, even as its western twin withered. The empire was not yet dead, but its breath grew shallow, and its enemies pressed ever closer. And so the world stood at the brink. A mighty empire, divided, its halves unequal, its destiny uncertain. The question was no longer whether Rome would be tested, but how soon the test would come, and who would survive when it did. The 5th century opened with omens of doom. Rome, once master of the known world, had become a fading titan, her body battered, her soul weary. Provinces slipped away like sand between clenched fists. Africa, the breadbasket of the empire, fell to the Vandals, and with it, the grain ships that had fed the city of Rome for centuries. Gaul fractured into petty kingdoms, Spain smoldered with rebellion, and Italy itself was a hollow shell, its wealth drained, its armies scattered. And yet, even in decline, Rome still produced figures who stood like giants against the tide. One such man was Flavius Aetius, called the last of the Romans. Born of mixed heritage, half barbarian and half Roman, Aetius understood the world as it truly was, a fusion of peoples, a struggle of shifting loyalties. With cunning diplomacy and hardened steel, he forged alliances with tribes that had once been enemies. When the Huns under Attila stormed into Europe, it was Aetius who rallied the remnants of Roman power. The year was 451, and the fate of the West trembled on a knife's edge. Attila, the scourge of God, led his horsemen across Gaul, leaving smoking ruins in his wake. His banners darkened the horizon, his riders struck terror into every village they passed. Against him marched Aetius with a patchwork army of Romans, Visigoths, and other allies, bound together by desperation. On the Catalonian plains, near modern-day Chalon, the two forces clashed in one of the most decisive battles of late antiquity. The earth shook with the thunder of hooves, the sky filled with cries of war. Thousands fell, their blood soaking the fields of Gaul. Aetius fought not only with the sword, but with strategy, maneuvering his allies with uncanny precision. When the day ended, Attila's advance was broken. The Huns withdrew, their aura of invincibility shattered. Rome, though battered, had endured yet again. For a brief moment, it seemed the empire might still defy its fate. But victories could not heal the deeper wounds. Aetius himself, the savior of Rome, was struck down not by enemies, but by the emperor he had preserved. Valentinian III, driven by jealousy and fear, murdered Aetius in his own palace. A courtier whispered afterward that the emperor had cut off his own right hand with his left. Without Aetius, the empire was leaderless, adrift, and fatally vulnerable. Soon after, Attila died. But the Huns were not the only threat. Vandals controlled Africa, Visigoths ruled Spain, Franks spread in Gaul, and Italy itself groaned beneath the weight of foreign mercenaries. By 476, the farce was complete. The emperor of the West was not a Caesar, not a general, but a boy, Romulus Augustulus. His very name was a cruel irony. Romulus, founder of the city, and Augustus, its first great emperor. Yet this Romulus was a shadow, a child placed upon the throne by men who ruled in his stead. When the Germanic chieftain Odoacer marched on Ravenna, there was no army left to resist, no Aetius to rally the legions. The boy was deposed without a fight. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, declaring that the West no longer needed an emperor. And so it ended, not with the roar of battle, but with a sigh of inevitability. The Western Roman Empire, once the greatest power on earth, was gone. Or so we believe, for history is a story written by outcomes. We know that Romulus Augustulus was dethroned, that Odoacer claimed Italy, that the eagle's wings folded at last. But let us pause. Let us imagine another turn. What if Aetius had not been murdered? What if Odoacer had not triumphed? What if, against all odds, the empire had endured beyond 476? The stage is set, the players stand ready, and history itself teeters on the edge of a different story. Now let us step across the threshold of imagination into a world where the story we know twists upon itself. In this alternate strand of history, the Western Roman Empire does not collapse in 486. Instead, it claws its way back from the brink, reinventing itself and surviving where in our world it perished. The divergence begins not with miracles, but with decisions. Valentinian III does not kill Aetius. Instead, the emperor, humbled by his general's brilliance, keeps him close. Aetius, with his unmatched skill in diplomacy and war, continues to balance the empire's fragile alliances. The Huns, broken at the Catalonian plains, never recover their dominance. Without their menace pressing Europe westward, the flood of migrating tribes slows. Rome gains the one thing it had lacked for decades: time. With time comes reform. Grain shipments from Africa, once threatened by the Vandals, remain secure. Instead of falling to Gaisaric's fleet, Carthage is wrestled back into Rome's embrace by Aetius's combined army of Romans and federated allies. The empire restores its breadbasket, ensuring both food and revenue for its people. Farmers return to their fields, cities swell again with life, and the specter of starvation lifts. Equally critical is the handling of the so-called barbarians. In our history, Rome's arrogance often turned potential allies into enemies. In this alternate world, necessity breeds pragmatism. Gothic warriors are not treated as expendable mercenaries, but as citizens in the making. Land grants in Gaul and Spain become permanent settlements under imperial oversight, with Gothic leaders welcomed into the Senate. Franks and Burgundians swear loyalty not as outsiders, but as Romans themselves. The empire ceases to fight a war of exclusion and instead forges a new synthesis, Roman in law and tradition, diverse in people and culture. Religious strife also finds resolution. Christianity had already bound much of the empire together, but in this world, emperors pursue unity rather than division. Aetius and his successors patronize the church while tempering its influence, ensuring that faith becomes a glue rather than a wedge. Pagan traditions fade without violence, absorbed into a Roman Christianity that is more inclusive, less fractured by schisms. Instead of East and West drifting apart, they are drawn closer through shared faith and shared purpose. As decades pass, stability grows. The imperial bureaucracy, bloated and corrupt, is trimmed and restructured. Taxes are reformed, easing the crushing burden on farmers while ensuring steady revenue. Roads are repaired, aqueducts maintained, and cities begin to thrive once more. In Ravenna, senators debate laws beneath mosaics of gold, while in Rome itself, the old forums echo again with commerce and oratory. By the end of the 5th century, when in our timeline Romulus Augustulus was deposed, the Western Empire still stands. Romulus exists, yes, but he is no helpless boy puppet. He grows into a ruler guided by Aetius and seasoned statesmen, a symbol of continuity between past glory and future promise. Odoacer, rather than toppling the empire, serves within it as a Romanized general, rewarded with estates and honors. His ambition bends toward loyalty, not rebellion. In this world, the eagle does not fold its wings. Instead, it spreads them wider. The Roman Empire, battered but reborn, stands united with its eastern counterpart. Constantinople and Rome do not gaze at each other with suspicion, but share resources, armies, and vision. The twin capitals, East and West, beat like two hearts within one body. The eternal empire has survived its trial by fire, and with survival comes the possibility of something even greater: expansion, renewal, and a future no longer bound by decline. But survival is never simple. With the empire preserved, the stage is set for new confrontations, against faiths rising in the deserts of Arabia, against kingdoms forging beyond the Rhine, and against the relentless march of time itself. The Roman story, far from ending, is about to take a turn both wondrous and terrifying. The empire reborn did not stand idle. By the 6th and 7th centuries, the world beyond its borders shifted like restless seas, and Rome, older, wiser, but still ambitious, prepared to meet the tide. The survival of the West meant the empire was no longer two uneasy halves, but one colossus with twin capitals. Constantinople glittered as the eastern jewel, while Rome itself, restored to prominence, became the western torch. Between them stretched a web of roads, garrisons, and fleets that bound Europe, Africa, and the Near East together. But peace was always fragile. To the south and east, a new storm gathered in the deserts of Arabia. From the sands rose Islam, a faith born in fire and revelation, carried by warriors who believed themselves destined to conquer the world. In our history, they shattered the exhausted Persians and hammered Byzantium, sweeping across Syria, Egypt, and North Africa before surging into Spain. But here, in this alternate world, they met a different reality. The Roman Empire they faced was not exhausted, not divided, not gasping for survival. It was unified, supplied, and prepared. When Muslim armies surged into Syria, they did not find a faltering Byzantine defense, but legions reinforced from both east and west. The desert campaigns became brutal wars of attrition, not swift conquests. At the battlefields of Yarmouk and Qadisiyah, where in our world Rome stumbled, the legions now stood firm, their discipline honed, their cavalry bolstered by Gothic and Frankish allies who had become Romans in all but name. The tide of conquest slowed, then broke. Instead of retreat, Rome pushed forward. Egypt remained within the empire's grasp, its fertile Nile ensuring food for millions. North Africa, instead of falling to Islamic fleets, was guarded by a restored Carthage, bristling with Roman triremes and Gothic sailors. The grain that once fed Muslim caliphates in our history continued to flow into Roman granaries. The Mediterranean, which might have become an Islamic sea, remained a Roman lake. This stalemate changed everything. Islam, though still vibrant, never expanded far beyond Arabia. Persia, battered but not annihilated, remained a buffer to the east. The great sweep of conquest that reshaped half the world was cut short, contained within the deserts that birthed it. For the first time in centuries, the empire faced not decline, but dominance. Yet this survival came with new consequences. The legions that stood against Islam did not march alone. They fought alongside federated tribes, Goths, Franks, Lombards, and Burgundians, all bound to Rome by oaths and land. These peoples, once considered outsiders, had become the empire's blood. Their chieftains sat in the Senate, their sons served as generals, their daughters married into old Roman families. The empire was no longer the Rome of Augustus. It had become a hybrid civilization, Roman in law and spirit, but diverse in people and culture. The West, which in our timeline fragmented into feudal kingdoms, here remained whole. There was no Charlemagne, for Rome itself was the empire of Christendom. There was no Holy Roman Empire, for the original never died. The Pope still raised his voice in Rome, but emperors ensured that the Church remained their partner, not their master. Religion bound the empire together instead of fracturing it into quarrels and schisms, and beyond religion, power shifted on the frontiers. The Slavs spread across the Balkans, meeting Roman legions along the Danube. The steppes still sent waves of riders, Avars, Bulgars, Magyars, but none could break through walls of stone and steel defended by both Constantinople and Ravenna. The Rhine frontier, long Rome's most fragile border, was now a Roman heartland, its once barbarian tribes transformed into pillars of the state. By the dawn of the 8th century, the empire stood unmatched. Its enemies had been checked, its borders secure, its heartlands prosperous. But survival also meant expansion, and expansion meant new conflicts. To the north, the pagan lands of Scandinavia and Germania beckoned. To the east, Persia simmered, neither conquered nor fully subdued. And far beyond, whispers reached Roman ears of civilizations in India, of silk empires in China, and of worlds still unknown across vast oceans. The empire had survived collapse, had defied the tide of history. But now it faced a new destiny, one not of survival, but of dominance, and of inevitable clash with other great powers. The eagle had endured. Now it would spread its wings to cast a shadow across the earth. The 8th and 9th centuries in this alternate world were not an age of darkness, but of dazzling light. Where our history descended into feudal fragmentation, here the eagle of Rome soared higher than ever. The empire, secure within its borders, turned its gaze inward, not to despair, but to renewal. What followed was nothing less than a Roman Renaissance, centuries before such a term would exist in our own timeline. Roads that had crumbled in our world were repaired and extended. Great highways stretched like veins from Britannia to Egypt, from Gaul to Syria, carrying caravans of silk, spices, and ideas. Aqueducts, once abandoned, flowed again, their arches standing proud across valleys and hills. The great cities, Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, did not shrink into medieval shadows. They flourished, teeming with artisans, scholars, and merchants. Urban life remained the heartbeat of civilization, not a relic of the past. Education thrived. The empire's bureaucrats, soldiers, and priests needed literacy, i.e., and so schools multiplied. Libraries modeled after the great halls of Alexandria appeared in provincial capitals. Ancient texts of Greece and Rome, which in our history were lost or rediscovered centuries later, remained in continuous use. Aristotle, Galen, and Cicero were not names whispered by monks in remote monasteries, but teachers in bustling academies. Science did not stall, it advanced. Trade networks linked Rome not only with Persia and India, but increasingly with China. Roman merchants, secure under imperial fleets that patrolled the seas, brought paper, gunpowder, and compass technology westward centuries earlier than in our timeline. Combined with the empire's tradition of engineering, these innovations sparked revolutions in thought and warfare. Imagine Roman scribes printing documents on presses in the 9th century, Roman generals experimenting with early explosives on the battlefield, Roman navigators charting seas with magnetic needles long before Columbus ever dreamed of crossing an ocean. Culturally, the empire became a mosaic. Gothic senators debated alongside Latin aristocrats in the Forum. Frankish commanders swore loyalty to emperors whose ancestors had once fought their people. Egyptians, Syrians, Berbers, and Iberians contributed their crafts, cuisines, and songs. Latin remained the language of law and administration, but in markets and villages, dialects flourished, blending into a tapestry of speech that gave life to both unity and diversity. Far from a rigid empire clinging to the past, Rome became a civilization that absorbed and transformed. Religion provided cohesion. Christianity, bound tightly to imperial authority, spread across the provinces not as a fractured church, but as a unified institution. Heresies that in our world divided the faithful were tempered by pragmatic emperors who balanced theology with politics. Pagan traditions were not crushed outright but reinterpreted, woven into festivals and rituals that enriched the Christian calendar. This inclusiveness bred stability, ensuring faith bound empire to emperor, rather than pitting bishop against Caesar. Economically, prosperity surged. The Mediterranean remained a Roman sea, bustling with merchant vessels. African grain, Spanish metals, Egyptian papyrus, and Eastern luxuries fueled growth. With secure borders and disciplined legions, local farmers no longer feared raids. Fields produced abundantly, and new crops, maize and potatoes, introduced far earlier through exploratory voyages, transformed agriculture, sustaining larger populations. The empire did not stand still in architecture or art either. Basilicas grew taller and more ornate, their domes shimmering with mosaics of gold and blue. Amphitheaters, long symbols of Rome's grandeur, found new life as venues for plays, debates, and even demonstrations of scientific discovery. Sculptors captured not only emperors and generals, but philosophers, inventors, and poets. Where our world's art retreated into monasteries, here it flourished in open forums. By the 10th century, while Europe in our timeline was still crawling through its Middle Ages, This Rome had already laid the groundwork for an early industrial age. Water wheels and windmills powered forges. Experimentation with steam, inspired by ancient texts and accelerated by abundant resources, hinted at engines that could transform labor. The empire was centuries ahead, standing at the edge of breakthroughs that our history would not see until the Renaissance and Enlightenment. But brilliance always casts shadows. With prosperity came ambition, and with ambition came rivalry. On the steppes, nomadic horsemen still stirred. In the Far East, the Tang dynasty of China grew powerful, its own culture confident and expansive. Two civilizations, Rome and China, vast and ancient, now faced each other across deserts, mountains, and trade routes. The question was no longer whether Rome would survive, but how it would wield its power against equals. The Roman Renaissance had ensured the empire's strength. Yet it also set the stage for conflict on a scale never before imagined. The eagle's wings now brushed the horizon, but another empire waited beyond, its dragon stirring. The dawn of the 10th century brought Rome into a world no longer of survival, but of confrontation. The empire, swollen with prosperity, stood as the unchallenged master of Europe and the Mediterranean. Its fleets commanded the seas, its legions patrolled vast frontiers, and its cities blazed with light when much of the outside world still lay in shadow. Yet beyond its borders, other giants stirred, and history demanded that colossi meet. To the east lay the Tang dynasty of China, an empire as ancient and proud as Rome itself. Across deserts and steppes, along the arteries of the Silk Road, whispers of Rome reached Chinese courts, just as tales of the Middle Kingdom drifted westward to Roman ears. Merchants carried silks and spices, but also stories of cities of marble, of emperors ruling with divine mandate, of armies whose discipline rivaled Rome's own. Two civilizations, separated by distance yet bound by ambition, now measured one another across the spine of Asia. At first, it was trade that connected them. Roman envoys arrived in Chang'an, their tunics startling the locals, their Latin tongues interpreted by Persian intermediaries. Chinese silks found eager buyers in Rome's markets, while Roman glassware and metallurgy intrigued the Tang court. But as commerce expanded, so too did rivalry. Both empires sought control of the steppes, the endless grasslands where Turkic and nomadic tribes shifted allegiances with the winds. To Rome, the steppes were a shield for its eastern provinces. To China, they were a barrier against invasion. The buffer could not belong to both. Clashes began indirectly. Roman gold funded one tribe, Chinese silver another. Roman-trained cavalry faced Chinese armed horsemen in proxy wars stretching across Central Asia. Slowly, inevitably, the conflict escalated. By the 11th century, legions and Chinese armies confronted each other openly along caravan routes, their banners snapping in the desert wind. For the first time in history, the eagle of Rome and the dragon of China glared at one another across drawn swords. The battles were unlike anything Rome had faced before. Chinese armies fielded crossbowmen in disciplined ranks, their bolts piercing Roman shields at range. Fire lances, primitive gunpowder weapons, spat flame and smoke, startling legionaries unaccustomed to such fury. Yet Rome was no stranger to adaptation. Engineers studied captured weapons, and soon Roman smiths forged their own designs. Catapults hurled not only stones, but explosive charges, packed with saltpeter and oil. On the fields of Samarkand and Bactria, fire met fire, steel clashed with steel. This arms race transformed both empires. Rome's tradition of engineering fused with Chinese innovation, accelerating the spread of gunpowder technology. Siege engines, once powered by torsion, gave way to bombards that shook city walls with thunder. Legions, once defined by Pila and Gladius, now marched with crossbows, early hand cannons, and steel-plated armor that gleamed beneath desert suns. War, which had shaped Rome for centuries, entered a new and terrible age. Yet the conflict was not only military. Diplomats schemed in courts from Constantinople to Chang'an, weaving alliances with Persia, India, and the nomadic Khazars. Religion, too, became a weapon. Rome, as the empire of Christendom, sought to convert the tribes of Central Asia, while China spread its Buddhist and Confucian traditions. The steppes became not only a battlefield of armies, but of cultures and creeds. Despite the ferocity of these struggles, neither side could fully conquer the other. The distances were vast, the costs immense. Victories were won, cities changed hands, but the frontier held. Instead of collapse, a balance of power emerged. Two titans locked in wary respect, each recognizing the other as a mirror of its own greatness. The world had never before known such equilibrium. Two empires, each capable of shaping continents, standing side by side, neither able to destroy the other. But while Rome gazed eastward, it also looked west, toward horizons unimagined. Its fleets, strengthened by centuries of naval dominance, began to venture farther into the Atlantic. What lay across the ocean was unknown, a mystery whispered in sailors' taverns and dreamed of by emperors hungry for glory. The age of confrontation with China had forged an empire of fire and steel. Now that same empire sought to cast its shadow, not just across the old world, but upon lands no Roman had yet seen. By the 12th century of this alternate world, the empire's gaze turned westward. Rome had survived the storms of barbarian invasions, checked the rise of Islam, and even clashed with China on the steppes of Asia. But beyond the Atlantic lay a horizon untouched, a canvas of mystery and promise. The old myths of islands across the sea, whispered by sailors in Iberian ports, no longer seemed fanciful to emperors hungry for expansion. Roman fleets, long masters of the Mediterranean, had evolved into ocean-faring leviathans. Triremes and galleys gave way to great caravels of oak and iron, their sails stretched taut against Atlantic winds. Navigation, aided by magnetic compasses and refined star charts, allowed daring admirals to push beyond sight of land. These voyages, sponsored not by private adventurers, but by the imperial state, carried with them the full weight of Roman ambition. And so it was that centuries before Columbus in our world, Roman sails crested the western waves and found new shores. The first landings were cautious, exploratory. The coasts of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico revealed civilizations both strange and sophisticated. Maya astronomers charted the heavens with uncanny precision. Mississippian mound builders commanded great river valleys. Aztec and Proto-Incan societies thrived in vibrant cities of stone and gold. To Rome, these peoples were not savages, but potential allies, or subjects. The encounters unfolded with both wonder and blood. Roman envoys marveled at temples that rose like mountains, markets bursting with cacao, maize, and feathers brighter than any dye of the Old World. Yet beneath diplomacy simmered the inevitable tension of conquest. Legions disembarked from ships in gleaming armor, their standards raised high, their presence an undeniable declaration. The empire had come to stay. At first, alliances were struck. Some native rulers welcomed the strangers, seeing in them protection against rival tribes. Others resisted, and resistance was met with iron. Roman ballistae hurled fire into wooden palisades. Steel swords cut down warriors armed with obsidian blades. Yet Rome also learned. Maize and potatoes, staples unknown in Europe, were ferried back across the Atlantic. These crops exploded across the empire's fields, feeding millions and fueling population growth. The Columbian exchange of our history occurred here centuries earlier, accelerating Rome's rise even further. Gold flowed eastward in staggering quantities. The empire, already wealthy, now brimmed with riches from across the sea. New coins were minted, their inscriptions proclaiming dominion not only over Europe, Africa, and Asia, but over lands newly christened Nova Roma. Senators debated not just the governance of Gaul or Egypt, but of provinces in distant continents. Roman governors in togas walked among the temples of the Yucatan, issuing decrees beneath the gaze of jaguar gods. The cultural impact was profound. Artists in Rome painted murals of exotic landscapes filled with parrots and jaguars. Poets composed verses about crimson maize fields and cities where pyramids kissed the sky. Traders in Alexandria sold cacao as a delicacy alongside Eastern spices. Philosophers speculated on the meaning of civilizations that had risen without Rome and what it meant now that they stood beneath its eagle. But expansion brought dangers as well. Diseases crossed oceans both ways. Plagues ravaged native populations, altering the balance of power, while Roman soldiers, exposed to unfamiliar fevers, perished in distant jungles. Resistance grew fierce, as confederations of tribes united against imperial encroachment. Rome faced not only conquest, but the challenge of integrating entirely new worlds into its system. Yet the empire pressed on. Its hunger for territory and wealth was insatiable, its belief in its own destiny unshakable. The Atlantic, once a boundary, became a Roman highway, fleets crossing with regularity. The old world and the new fused centuries before our timeline allowed, reshaping human civilization in ways no one could have imagined. And as the 12th century turned into the 13th, the empire found itself more powerful than ever, spanning not only continents, but oceans. The eagle had crossed the sea, and its shadow now stretched across half the world. But with great reach came new rivals. Could even Rome command such vastness without breaking under its own weight? And what would happen when its New World provinces began to dream of freedom, just as the old provinces once had? The stage was set for struggles not of survival, but of identity. By the 13th century of this alternate history, the Roman Empire had ceased to be merely a Mediterranean power. It had become a planetary civilization, a force that stretched across continents and oceans, commanding wealth and knowledge unimaginable in our timeline. The eagle, once carved in marble on the Capitoline Hill, now adorned fortresses in Gaul, harbors in Africa, temples in the Yucatan, and plazas along the Mississippi. It was no longer the empire of Augustus or Constantine. It was the empire of the world. The integration of the New World transformed Rome in ways that even its emperors had not foreseen. Gold and silver, mined by Roman engineers and local allies alike, poured into imperial coffers, fueling an economy that dwarfed any rival. But more important than treasure were crops. Maize, potatoes, tomatoes, and cacao revolutionized diets across the empire. Populations soared, cities expanded, and famines that once haunted antiquity receded into memory. The empire now possessed not just territory, but the means to feed and sustain hundreds of millions. With prosperity came innovation. The technological sparks lit in the Roman Renaissance of earlier centuries now roared into flame. Printing presses churned out books by the thousands, spreading knowledge not only to elites but to common citizens. Guilds of artisans became academies of scientists, their workshops filled with strange devices of glass, steel, and fire. Gunpowder weapons, refined over generations of conflict with China, became standard in every legion. Cannons bristled on fortress walls. Arquebuses thundered in disciplined volleys. By the 14th century, steam engines hissed in Roman foundries. Harnessing ancient principles rediscovered from Hero of Alexandria and fueled by the empire's wealth, inventors constructed machines that transformed industry. Looms wove cloth at speeds no hand could match. Hammers pounded iron without ceasing, and ships with paddle wheels churned the waters of the Mediterranean. The Industrial Revolution of our world, delayed until the 18th century, arrived here centuries earlier, under the shadow of the eagle. Urban life reflected this transformation. Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, and Carthage became metropolises of 500,000 souls or more, their streets lit by oil lamps and, later, experimental gaslights. Aqueducts fed public fountains, while sewers kept disease at bay. The empire's cities hummed with markets, where merchants from the Americas sold maize beside silk traders from China. Diversity was no longer a challenge to imperial identity. It was its essence. To be Roman in this world was not to be Italian or Greek, but to belong to a universal civilization. Culturally, this vastness produced a flowering unlike any before. Philosophers debated not only Plato and Aristotle, but Aztec astronomers and Chinese sages. Roman poets sang of the stars, envisioning them not as distant fires, but as realms awaiting conquest. Historians chronicled the empire's 1,000 years of endurance, marveling at how a city born beside the Tiber now commanded both the Old World and the New. Religion, too, evolved. Christianity remained the imperial faith, but its rituals absorbed influences from many lands, creating a cosmopolitan creed that blended Roman liturgy with African hymns and American symbolism. Yet such dominance came at a cost. With every frontier secured, the empire began to turn inward, and ambition bred tension. Provincial governors in the New World, enriched by mines and plantations, grew restless under distant oversight. Senators in Rome debated whether these lands should remain colonies or become equal provinces. The question of identity, who was truly Roman, gnawed at the empire's unity. Abroad, rivals still stirred. China, though unable to conquer Rome, had not collapsed. Its dynasties continued to rise and fall, producing innovations of their own. India, a land of empires and wealth, remained beyond Roman control, a tantalizing frontier. Even the steppes, though pacified, were never silent, always birthing new riders and threats. Rome's supremacy was immense, but it was never absolute. By the 15th century, speculation turned toward the heavens. With steam engines, mathematics, and astronomy advancing in tandem, Roman engineers imagined machines that could fly, devices that could pierce the sky. Observatories in Hispania tracked the movements of planets, while philosophers in Alexandria debated whether the moon could be reached. In our world, such dreams belong to futurists centuries later. In this Rome, they belong to the empire of now. The 1,000-year empire had achieved what no civilization before it had ever managed: unbroken continuity, endless adaptation, relentless growth. It stood as both ruler and architect of a world reshaped by its will. Yet greatness brings its own dangers. For in empires that stretch too far and last too long, the seeds of hubris and rebellion always take root. The question was no longer whether Rome could endure, but whether it should, and what would happen when its own children turned against it. And so, at the end of our journey, we stand before the vision of a Rome that never fell, a Rome that survived the storms of the 5th century, endured the clash of faiths, and strode across oceans to claim the New World centuries before any Columbus or Cortez. This eternal empire, forged in fire and tempered in steel, shaped not merely a continent, but the destiny of the planet. In this timeline, the Middle Ages never came. The Renaissance dawned centuries early, the Industrial Revolution arrived before the world was ready, and human history leapt forward at a staggering pace. The legions, once armed with pila and gladius, became gunpowder armies clad in iron. The aqueducts of antiquity gave way to steam engines, railways, and vast manufactories that hummed with invention. And beyond the seas, the provinces of Nova Roma reshaped the empire into a transoceanic power, a civilization not of one hemisphere but of both. What would it mean to live in such a world? On the one hand, it might be a golden age beyond imagination. Roads would never have crumbled into dust. Libraries never would have burned without replacement. Knowledge would have been preserved and multiplied. Disease, famine, and ignorance would have been pushed back by centuries of uninterrupted progress. Imagine standing in a Roman city in the 15th century, illuminated by lamps, connected by railways, alive with the hum of machines. To its citizens, it might feel as though the gods themselves had blessed the empire. Yet, on the other hand, such grandeur could conceal a darker truth. The Roman state, for all its majesty, was also a machine of power, order, and control. The same empire that built aqueducts also crucified rebels. The same legions that defended civilization also enforced it with iron discipline. Would the citizens of conquered lands, from Gaul to the Yucatan, truly feel free? Would progress belong to all, or only to those who knelt beneath the eagle? The Pax Romana, stretched across continents, might be peace for some, but oppression for many. And what of identity? Over the centuries, Rome's genius had been its ability to absorb, to turn outsiders into citizens. But by the 15th century, when the empire spanned half the globe, could that identity endure? Could an Incan farmer in the Andes or a Frankish merchant in Gaul truly feel the same as a senator in Rome? The empire might be eternal, yes, but eternity often demands sacrifice. Perhaps, just as provinces once dreamed of breaking free, so too would Nova Roma eventually rise against the motherland, seeking independence, not unlike our own age of revolutions. This, then, is the paradox of the eternal empire. In surviving, it reshapes the world so completely that it creates new challenges far greater than the ones it once feared. It dodges collapse only to face questions no Caesar or Senate could ever fully answer. And so we return, at last, to our own timeline, to the ruins scattered across Europe and the Mediterranean, to broken aqueducts, crumbled forms, and shattered amphitheaters, to a world that rose not from the continuity of empire, but from its ashes. The collapse of Rome gave birth to nations, to new cultures, to the Renaissance that rediscovered what had been lost. Without that fall, perhaps we would not be who we are. Would you want to live in that other world? In a civilization of wonders and marvels, centuries ahead of its time, but beneath the unyielding shadow of the eagle? Would you choose the brilliance of Rome eternal, or the freedom born of its collapse? History is not a single road, but a web of possibilities. We walk one path, but others remain in shadow. By imagining them, we see our own more clearly. The story of Rome is not only about what was, but what might have been. Now we ask you, what do you think? Would the eternal empire have been a blessing or a curse? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed this journey through alternate history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that together we may continue exploring the great what-ifs of history.